The crunch of gravel beneath my tires is always the same. It's comforting in a way, that familiar sound signaling the start of another night shift. The radio station stands like a lonely sentinel against the mountainside, a single red light blinking atop its antenna to warn aircraft that rarely pass this way. There's no one else around for miles, just the endless trees, the whisper of the wind, and the occasional howl of a distant coyote. I parked my car and stepped out, pulling my jacket tighter against the chill. It always felt colder up here, as if the mountain had its own breath, exhaling frost into the night. The station loomed ahead, its windows dark except for the faint glow of the studio on the second floor. I hurried inside, locking the heavy steel door behind me. Rule 1. The sound of the lock sliding into place was like muscle memory now. You don't think about it, you just do it. The building was small, just 2 floors and a basement. The ground floor had a break room, some storage, and the transmitter room. Upstairs was my domain, the studio. A narrow stairwell creaked beneath my boots as I climbed, each step feeling like a countdown to my shift. The studio was exactly how I'd left it that morning. A soundboard covered in knobs and sliders, a microphone hanging from a swivel arm, and my stack of pre-approved playlists sitting neatly in their labeled folders. I flipped on the lights, bathing the room in a pale artificial glow. The blinds were already drawn, but I made sure they were shut tight. Rule 2. The rules hung on a yellowed sheet of paper taped to the wall by the soundboard, their edges curling from age. I didn't need to read them anymore. I'd memorized them years ago. 1. Lock the doors immediately after arriving. 2. Close the blinds after sundown. 3. Never leave the radio unattended during a broadcast. 4. Never play music that wasn't pre-approved. 5. If you hear tapping on the windows, don't look outside. 6. If a listener mentions the forgotten, end the call immediately. Some of them made sense. Locking the doors in a place this isolated? That was just common sense. Keeping the blinds closed at night? Maybe someone thought it was a safety precaution, though I couldn't imagine anyone lurking out here. But the rest? Those were harder to explain. I'd asked once, back when I first started. My supervisor, a gruff man named Edgar, just gave me a look and said, "You want to stay here long? Follow the rules." So I did. For 5 years now, I'd followed them without question. They were part of the rhythm of my nights, as natural as flipping switches and queuing up tracks. I settled into my chair, running through my checklist. Levels were good, signal was strong, playlist loaded. At exactly 8 p.m., I hit the button, and the station's jingle crackled to life through the speakers. "Good evening, night owls," I said, my voice sliding into its practiced warmth. "This is Camila, and you're tuned into Whispers in the Night, your nightly dose of stories, songs, and secrets." The intro music faded, leaving only the hum of the station. It was time for my favorite part of the night, taking calls from listeners. Their stories ranged from the absurd to the genuinely chilling, and I loved hearing the little glimpses into their lives. The phone line lit up almost immediately, and I took a deep breath. The routine was so ingrained by now, I barely thought about it anymore. The rules, the calls, the quiet isolation, it all blurred into a rhythm that felt safe, predictable. But tonight felt different, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the wind howled louder than usual, rattling the building's old windows. Or maybe it was the flicker of the studio lights, just for a second, as if something had passed through the room. I shook it off, forcing a smile into my voice as I answered the first call. "You're on the air with Camila. What's your story tonight?" The voice on the other end was soft, almost hesitant. "Hi, Camila. Have you ever heard of something called the Forgotten?" The line hissed with static, and my stomach dropped. Rule 6. For a moment, I froze, my hand tightening around the mic. The caller's question echoed in my head. "Have you ever heard of something called the Forgotten?" Rule 6 was clear. End the call immediately. My thumb hovered over the disconnect button, but I hesitated. Maybe they didn't mean it like that. Maybe it was just a coincidence. "Sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We don't talk about that here." The caller chuckled, a low, dry rasp that didn't sound quite right, like it was coming from a throat unused to speaking. "You should," they said. I hit the button, cutting them off mid-sentence. The line went dead, replaced by a crackle of static that lingered longer than it should have. My pulse pounded in my ears as I forced myself to focus, reaching for the next line blinking on the switchboard. "You're on the air with Camila. What's your story tonight?" The next few calls were more typical, thank God. A teenager recounting a local urban legend about a haunted bridge. A woman describing a shadowy figure she'd seen standing at the foot of her bed. Creepy, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary for this show. Still, I couldn't shake the unease lingering in the back of my mind. The room felt colder, the shadows in the corners darker. Every so often the signal would flicker with brief bursts of static. It wasn't uncommon in weather like this, but tonight it felt wrong, like something was trying to push through. "Must be the wind messing with the antenna," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. Another call came in. This one was a man with a thick southern drawl, telling me about a time he'd seen glowing red eyes in the woods near his cabin. I nodded along, making the right noises, but my attention kept drifting. Something was gnawing at me, though I couldn't name it. Then, the line blinked again. Another caller. "Good evening, you're on Whispers in the Night. What's your story?" I asked, my voice slipping into its usual rhythm. This time the silence stretched longer than it should have. I frowned, glancing at the switchboard to make sure the connection was live. "Hello?" I prompted. A soft breath crackled through the speakers, followed by a voice that sent a shiver down my spine. "Do you believe in them, Camila?" It was the same voice as before, the raspy, broken whisper, the one who'd asked about the forgotten. I yanked my hand away from the mic, my gut instinct screaming to cut the call. But something kept me frozen. Maybe it was the way they said my name, like they'd known me for years. "You're not supposed to call here," I said, trying to sound firm, but hearing the tremor in my own voice. "They don't like it when you break the rules," the voice rasped. "Do you know what happens when you break them?" The static rose, loud and grating, drowning out the edges of their words. I leaned forward, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who are you?" I demanded, gripping the edge of the desk. "They'll come for you," the voice said, the words so distorted now they barely sounded human. "When you break the rules, they come for you, and then, you become one of us." The call ended abruptly, replaced by a harsh burst of static that lingered for several seconds before fading into silence. I stared at the switchboard, my fingers trembling as I reached for the disconnect button, though the line had already gone dead. The room seemed unbearably quiet now. The only sound the faint hum of the equipment around me. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It read 9:13 p.m. But that couldn't be right. I'd started my segment at 8 sharp, and I'd only taken a handful of calls. It should have been closer to 8:30. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The air felt heavy, thick enough to choke on. Then I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. It was slow and deliberate, like knuckles rapping against glass. Once, twice. I turned my back to the sound, my pulse roaring in my ears. Rule 5. Never look outside. The tapping came again, louder this time. I forced myself to sit back down, my movements stiff and mechanical. My fingers fumbled with the playlist controls, queuing up the next track as if it could drown out the sound. But the tapping didn't stop, it just kept going, and in the reflection of the soundboard's polished surface, I could swear I saw a shadow moving behind me. The tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, each knock spaced perfectly apart as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was waiting for me to react. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to keep my back to the window. Rule 5, Camila. Rule 5. My mind repeated it like a mantra, even as the sound grew sharper, almost like nails scraping against the glass. I focused on the soundboard, desperate for a distraction. The playlist was still running, or at least it should have been. The current song faded out and I expected the next one to start. But instead, there was silence. I stared at the monitor. The timer on the playlist was frozen, stuck it though. My stomach twisted as I reached for the controls, trying to manually skip to the next track. Nothing happened. Then the speakers crackled. A low, droning note poured from the monitor, vibrating through the room like a growl. It wasn't on the playlist. I knew every track by heart, and this wasn't one of them. "Come on," I muttered, jabbing at the controls. The sound didn't stop. It only grew louder, warping into something that sounded almost human. A voice layered and distorted, humming a melody that felt impossibly old. Rule 4. Never play music that wasn't pre-approved. My throat went dry as I realized what was happening. The playlist hadn't just glitched, something, or someone, was interfering. I grabbed the emergency shutdown switch, a last resort for cutting the broadcast, but the lever refused to budge. My hand slipped against the slick metal, my palm damp with sweat. The song continued to play, the strange voice rising and falling in a way that made my skin crawl. The tapping on the window grew louder, now almost like pounding. I snapped my head toward the sound before I could stop myself. The blinds were still drawn, but I could see a faint shadow just beyond them. It wasn't moving, just standing there, impossibly still. "Damn it," I whispered, standing and taking a step toward the window. My legs felt heavy, as if the air in the room had thickened around me. "Don't look. Don't look." But I had to. I needed to know. My fingers trembled as I reached for the edge of the blinds, pulling them back just enough to peek outside. A figure stood on the other side of the glass. It was tall and thin, its silhouette barely visible in the faint moonlight. The features were obscured, but its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it were trying to peer into the room. I locked eyes with it, or at least I thought I did. It didn't have eyes, not exactly. Just two hollow, dark pits where they should have been. My breath hitched as I stumbled backward, letting the blinds fall shut again. The pounding on the window stopped. I turned away, my pulse racing, and grabbed the edge of the soundboard to steady myself. But the moment I looked back at the controls, I knew something was wrong. The shadows in the room were moving. They stretched across the walls and ceiling, twisting and bending like they were alive. The overhead lights flickered, their buzzing hum growing louder until it felt like the whole room was vibrating. The clock on the wall caught my eye. The hands were spinning wildly, faster and faster, the numbers blurring together. "Stop," I whispered, though I didn't know who or what I was talking to. Then the static returned, louder than ever, and within it I heard my name. "Camila." It wasn't a single voice. It was many, layered together in a cacophony of whispers and moans. The sound filled the room, pressing against my skull like a physical force. "Camila, you broke the rules." I backed toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows seemed to follow me, their edges curling and flickering like flames. The static grew louder, the voices merging into a single, distorted scream. Then everything went silent. The light stopped flickering, the shadows froze, even the hum of the equipment died away, leaving only the faint sound of my own breathing. I turned toward the window again, dreading what I might see. The blinds were still closed, but the shadow was gone. For a moment, I let myself believe it was over, that whatever had just happened was done. But then, faintly, from somewhere deep within the static, I heard it again. "Camila?" And this time, it was coming from inside the room. The silence pressed against my ears like cotton, thick and suffocating. For a brief, blissful moment, I let myself believe it was over. That whatever had happened, whatever had twisted its way into the station, was finally gone. The phone rang. The sharp, shrill tone shattered the silence, sending a jolt through my chest. I stared at the switchboard, where a single line blinked red. The caller ID was blank. My instincts screamed at me to ignore it. "Don't pick up. Don't break another rule." But the sound was relentless, echoing off the walls and drilling into my skull. My hand moved on its own, trembling as I reached for the receiver. "Whispers in the night," I said, my voice cracking. "Hello, Camila." The voice was clearer this time, no longer distorted by static. It was low and smooth, carrying an edge of familiarity that made my skin crawl. "You again," I whispered, my grip on the receiver tightened. "How are you calling me?" They chuckled, a sound that was somehow both amused and cold. "You should really know better by now." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. "What do you want?" "To talk," they said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "After all, we have so much in common, don't we? You've been here for years, following the rules, pretending you're safe. But you've always known, haven't you? You've always felt it." My stomach twisted. Felt what? They didn't answer right away. Instead, the line hissed softly, like a slow exhale. "Do you remember what happened your first month here? The night you heard someone calling your name from the woods?" The memory hit me like a slap. I hadn't thought about that in years. I'd been new to the station then, still figuring out the rules. I'd heard the voice just after my shift ended, soft and pleading, drifting in from the tree line. It had sounded like my sister, even though I knew she was hundreds of miles away. I'd almost gone outside. Almost. I didn't break the rules, I said quickly, my voice shaking. No, the caller agreed, but you hesitated, long enough to let something slip through. I felt the blood drain from my face. That's not true. Oh, but it is. You're part of this now, Camila. You always have been. Don't you see? This place doesn't just protect you, it keeps you here. Keeps us all here. Their words wrapped around me like barbed wire, squeezing tighter with every syllable. Who are you? I demanded. I'm what happens when you fail, they said. I was like you once, a voice in the dark, filling the silence for anyone willing to listen. But I made a mistake. I didn't follow the rules, and now, I'm here. I gripped the desk, my knuckles white. You're lying. Am I? The voice grew softer, almost tender. Think, Camila. How long have you been here? How many shifts? How many nights? It all blends together after a while, doesn't it? Time doesn't move the same way here. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. They were right. The days and nights had started to blur years ago, slipping away like water through my fingers. The voice continued, relentless. You broke the rules once, and it's already begun. The forgotten. We're the ones who didn't follow through, the ones who let the rules slip, and now we're part of the station. No, I whispered, shaking my head. I would know, I would remember. Would you? Or have you been telling yourself it's just another shift, another routine night in your little box on the mountain? The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my chest heaving, and then the equipment around me began to fail. The monitors blinked off, one by one, their screens going black. The soundboard crackled with static before cutting out entirely. Even the emergency backup lights dimmed, plunging the room into shadows. The air turned cold, heavy with the stench of damp earth and decay. The shadows on the walls started to shift again, twisting into vaguely human shapes. They stood motionless, their blank faces turned toward me. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room seemed to stretch and warp, the walls curving inward like the ribs of some massive, living thing. One of the shadows stepped forward. Its movement was slow, deliberate, and it stopped just shy of the desk. Then, in a voice that sounded achingly familiar, it whispered, Camila. The room was alive. I could feel it breathing. The walls groaned softly, their surfaces rippling as though some unseen force pulsed beneath them. The air grew thicker, pressing against my chest until every breath felt like dragging shards of glass through my lungs. The floor beneath my feet shifted, creaking in a way that wasn't just old wood, it was deliberate, like something was moving beneath the surface. The shadowy figure hadn't moved. It still stood in the corner, just beyond the reach of the dim, flickering emergency lights. My legs refused to work, my back pressed hard against the desk. Who are you? I croaked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. It didn't respond. The longer I stared, the clearer its shape became. The shadows clinging to it began to dissolve, revealing features that twisted my stomach in knots. It was a person. Or, at least, it had been. Their skin was stretched too tight over a skeletal frame, their jaw hanging loose like it had forgotten how to close. Their eyes, if you could call the hollow, glinting voids that seemed to pierce through me. My stomach churned as recognition flickered at the edge of my mind. It wasn't just anyone. I knew them. Alex, I whispered. Alex had been the DJ before me, back when I'd just started at the station. They'd vanished years ago, leaving behind nothing but their car parked haphazardly outside. The official story had been something mundane, abandonment, burnout. But now, looking at the warped remains of their face, I knew the truth was anything but. The figure tilted its head at an unnatural angle, its neck cracking with the motion. You should have left, it said in a voice that was both familiar and grotesquely wrong. My stomach flipped. I turned away, desperate to look at anything else, and that's when I saw it. A crumpled piece of paper sat at the edge of the desk, its corner fluttering slightly in an unseen breeze. I didn't remember putting it there. My hands shook as I grabbed it, unfolding the yellowed, brittle sheet. The writing was jagged, scrawled as if by a hand trembling in terror. Never look for the truth. The rules are the only thing keeping you alive. Follow them. Always. Beneath the warning, more words had been scratched over and over, carving deep into the page. Don't look back. The air in the room shifted again, the oppressive cold now laced with something sharper, more dangerous. I crumpled the note in my hand and glanced at the door. I had to leave. Now. I stumbled toward the exit, fumbling for my keys. My fingers felt numb as I jammed the key into the lock and twisted. Nothing happened. No, 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 I whispered, my voice rising in panic. I yanked the key out and tried again. The lock refused to budge, the mechanism grinding uselessly as though rusted shut. Behind me, I heard a soft scrape. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. Don't look back, I muttered, repeating the note's warning like a prayer. But the sound came again, a dragging, shuffling noise, inching closer. I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned. Alex, or what was left of them, was moving. Their body twitched and jerked with each step, as though unfamiliar with how to walk. Their head tilted too far to one side and their mouth stretched into a gaping, toothless grin. Stay with us, Camila, they crooned, their voice crackling like a broken speaker. I stumbled backward, slamming against the door. My mind raced, clawing for a solution, for any way out of this nightmare. The rules. The rules. They'd always kept me safe before, but I'd already broken too many. I felt the vibrations beneath my feet again, stronger this time. The floorboards bulged as though something massive was slithering just below the surface. The walls shuddered, the groaning sound rising into an almost deafening wail. My breath came in shallow gasps as I twisted the key again, harder this time. Finally, with a sickening click, the lock gave way. The door creaked open, just enough for me to slip through. I didn't hesitate, throwing myself into the dark hallway beyond. The door slammed shut behind me, sealing the station, and whatever was inside it, away. But as I stood there, trembling in the cold, damp corridor, I realized something chilling. The hallway wasn't supposed to be this long. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, a dark, suffocating tunnel that seemed to pulse with life. My legs trembled, my breath shallow, but I forced myself to move forward. Each step echoed in the void, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The walls, slick with condensation, seemed to lean inward, their surfaces rippling as though alive. When I reached the main broadcast room again, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? Time didn't make sense anymore. The room was exactly as I'd left it, yet everything felt different, heavier, colder. The equipment hummed with a strange, rhythmic static, almost like a heartbeat. And then I heard them. You're so close now, Camila, the voices whispered, layered and overlapping, as if a crowd spoke in unison. The sound wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from everywhere. I sank into the chair, my hands gripping the edges of the desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. What do you want from me? I demanded, my voice cracking. To teach you, they said, to show you why the rules exist. The static on the monitors began to shift, forming distorted images. Faces emerged, half-remembered, warped by time and something darker. I recognized some. Alex, their empty eyes staring through me. Others were strangers, their expressions frozen in anguish. The rules keep the living and the forgotten apart, the voices continued. You've broken them, Camila, again and again. And now, the boundary is gone. My stomach churned as the truth sunk in. The rules weren't arbitrary. They weren't just tradition. They were a fragile barrier, the only thing standing between me and whatever hellish fate awaited those who failed. No, I whispered, shaking my head, I didn't mean to. It doesn't matter, they interrupted, their tone cold and final. You belong to the station now. The air in the room grew heavier, the lights dimming until only the faint glow of the equipment remained. The shadows that had once lurked at the edges of the room now closed in, circling me like vultures. I glanced at the microphone, the little red light blinking steadily. The station's signal was still live. Someone might be listening. A desperate idea sparked in my mind. I leaned forward, my hands trembling as I adjusted the mic. My voice cracked as I began to speak. This is Camila, broadcasting live from station 103.9, I said, forcing the words out. If you're listening, please, listen closely. The shadows around me pulsed, their forms flickering with agitation. The rules, they're not just guidelines. They're meant to protect you. Don't question them. Don't break them. If you hear someone mention the forgotten, hang up. If you hear tapping, don't look outside. Whatever you do, don't let the rules slip. The shadows drew closer, their whispers growing louder, overlapping until they became an unbearable cacophony. My voice faltered, my throat tightening as the air turned icy. And if you're ever offered this job, I continued, my words tumbling out in a rush, think twice. It's not what it seems. The station, it doesn't let you leave. Not really. The microphone began to crackle, my voice distorting, blending with the static. My reflection in the dark monitor stared back at me, but it wasn't my face anymore. It was hollow, distorted, becoming one of them. My hands moved on their own, twisting the knobs, adjusting the frequency. The static grew louder, drowning out my words. My final broadcast was swallowed by the noise. The last thing I heard before everything faded was the faint rhythmic tapping on the window. The new DJ arrived at the station the next morning, their car crunching over the gravel driveway. They whistled softly, carrying a bag of equipment, as they approached the building. Inside, the station was pristine, every surface polished and orderly. The previous DJ was nowhere to be found. They set their bag down and glanced at the rules posted on the wall. There was a new addition at the bottom, written in the same faded ink as the others. Rule 7, never ask what happened to Camila.